everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Sue Kitson, who quickly rewrote her CV for me a few moments ago. She studied biology at Wits and has a PhD in cell biology. She's been a developmental biologist at UCT since 1988 in the Department of Human Biology. She's supervised many postgraduate students, has been head of department, deputy dean, acting dean. Her great interests are in zoology, genetics, archaeology, and history. This particular project, Equus in Africa, she will be explaining in more detail, but suffice it to say it's not something she's doing on her own. And she's been collaborating with, amongst others, Erica Brummage, who has a background in theatre and who has done a lot of research for the project. And we're going to hear more about that too, very soon. So thank you very much, Sue.
Thank you. Thank you. To get us in the mood, we're going to darken the room and we have a 90-second clip to play for you. Please enjoy. Welcome, everyone. Good evening. Lovely to have you here. I hope you enjoyed that. I had nothing to do with making it. It was my colleagues, Erica and Catherine, who I'll introduce in a moment. So to say, I'm Sue Kitson. I work at medical school. And once I said to Erica, she was sitting around the dinner table together, and she was telling me that she and Catherine had been plotting together for now about a year to produce, had an idea of producing a series. It started with donkeys of Lesotho, and it got bigger and bigger and bigger, and the next thing it was Equus in the whole of Africa. And I was hearing this, and I said, oh, don't you want somebody to work with you? I had just finished doing a tour of administrative duty, and I thought this would be fun. And so I began to become involved in it. And so this talk today, how did this talk come about? It was because the work that's been done over the past 5 years by the Equus in Africa project team, who's Erica, Catherine sitting there, and Bruce, who is not here tonight. And with this vision, they've been working intensively for years, and now so have I. Yeah, so they've been working intensively, and so the idea was tonight, I said one mad evening, well, don't you want to present this at summer school? And of course that was taken up. So really, what is this about? It's just a journey that I'm going to take you through a whole lot of disciplines, and it's really about who we are. Who are the equids? Where do they come from? How do they come to be where they are? And this whole desire to explore that's what makes us human. And in working on the series about a year ago, it had to be presented at a particular film what do you call it, a film market. And we divided the project into these 6 different topics because we found that they were getting more and more and more filled with information. And we chose today to speak just to the ancestral journeys, the shapes and sizes, and the one on power. And even so, we've selected just tidbits of material to help you understand how equids. And I think the question I asked myself, and maybe you would, is when I heard they were doing this, I said, but there must be hundreds of movies on Equus, and there must have been more than hundreds of books. And the answer is yes, that's true. But actually, it is true. There are none that focus on Africa in particular. And that set us off doing this. So we start off today. And I just wanted to say that I will be sitting down sometimes. My knees are not, I had surgery recently, so I might have to sit. So pardon me for that. I'm going to take you through a journey, a 55 million year journey in about half an hour. So hold your horses and keep going with me. Okay, so starting off in East Africa, in Tanzania, in the rich fossil site at Laetoli, in the Olduvai Gorge, which, as you know, has released or revealed many, many, many human fossils. And it was in about 1976 that famous anthropologist Mary Leakey was working, and they came upon this amazing set of footprints. I'm sure many of you know about it. They were found in 1976, but they were uncovered in 1978. And what you can clearly see is these are human-type footprints. There's the adult, and there is the child, or the youngster walking with him. And on analyzing these footprints and the other fossils in the same layer of the earth, it was worked out that these come from 3.5 million years ago. They were the first footprints found fossilized. You can clearly see the big toe and the smaller toes and the foot and the heel of the foot. Here is Mary Leakey measuring the size. So they had to measure the size and the distance apart and all sorts of things. And from that, they extrapolate for what hominid is. Don't forget, we will have worked out many, many hominids. And it turns out that this is how they were formed. This Sandeman volcano, which is about 20 kilometers east of Laetoli, was erupting, producing this ash through which these early humans or human ancestors walked, leaving their footprints in the sand. And actually, they've been found a few years ago, and this is in a paper from recently, another team from Tanzania and from Italy have uncovered more footprints in the same area. So these footprints there were all sorts of other animal footprints there. Now, if we look at our original picture carefully, look again. We're focusing our eye on this, but look here. There are other footprints coming there. And what are they? We look at them in detail, and we can see that they have one big imprint and some little imprints on the side. And interestingly, there's also a larger one and a little small one. If you looked at the previous slide, you'll see that the smaller one is wandering and crossing the path of the adult. And this obviously comes from an equid, a perissodactyl. It's got one long toe, the middle toe, number 3, but it's got number 2 and number 4. And it was identified to be the equid Hipparion, which, as you must admit, looks very like a horse. So it's very horse-like. Actually, it's not in the direct line of Equus, as I'll show you. They even were able to work out that it had a running walk, and it was running about between that kilometers per hour. The side toes did touch down, and what they showed, and this was really detailed computer analysis of these footprints compared to horses that they're testing in modern time, and they showed that this gait, this running walk gait, is something not taught by humans, because many people would have thought that we teach horses how to run in certain ways. But actually, this is intrinsic to equids, and probably from 3.5 million years ago. And we're sure that it's an equid because in addition to that, there were teeth found. Eventually, there were whole skeletons found. And I will tell you a little bit more about the dentition in a minute, because it turns out that dentition is a critical thing to understand equids. Actually, we have heparin right down here in our neighborhood, in the West Coast Fossil Park. This is the jaw that was found there. These are the front lower teeth here. And this is what the park looks like now, and this is what it might have looked like a long time ago. Okay, so now the question is, so we have a precursor of an equid sitting in Africa 3.5 million years ago. We know that humans originated in Africa and thereby distributed. So that tells us, well, wouldn't it be interesting if equids also, in fact, evolved in Africa? Furthermore, is it possible, because in Africa we've got horses, we've got asses, and we've got zebras, did they give rise to all three of them? And in fact, they're all over the world, all different horses, types, and donkeys. Well, the answer is no, of course not, because we know well from the literature that horses or equids actually developed in North America. And the fossil record for that is very, very thorough and very, very clear. So then the question is, well, then what is this guy doing here in Africa? How did he get here? And did anything become of him? And then how did all the others get here as well? But by the way, you're free to interrupt me or tell me to go faster, slow down, or ask a question. I don't mind being interrupted. Okay, so just to remind us that extant means the currently living equids in the world are classed into three groups: the zebra group, the asses and donkeys, and the horses. And they all live in Africa. There are no other continents that indigenously have all three of them. And just a bit of genetics, we take DNA, they take DNA, you can take DNA from fossils now, and you can analyze the DNA. I'll tell you a little bit more about that tomorrow. And then you do computer analysis, and you can show what is more related to what. And understandably, the zebras all what we call cluster together, and you can see the Hartmann divided off early. If we look at the asses and donkeys, we can see that they are more closely related to zebras than they are to horses. And that's not so surprising to us either, because if you think about it, donkeys look more like zebras than they look like horses. Okay, so just keep in mind, we're going to be talking about asses and donkeys, zebras and horses. What are the tools of the trade that we need to use to be able to uncover this? Of course, as research advances, we get newer ideas. But without a fossil, without something there, we are nowhere. So we have to have evidence, though in many cases we can have the evidence that there was something there. For example, a footprint or an imprint from a piece of skin. We analyze where they are. So if you're analyzing, for example, birds, and you suddenly get a strange bird from North Africa and South Africa, you ask yourself, that's a bit funny, maybe that's just a mistake. So by using biogeography, you can also add to the information that you need to analyze the different equids that there are. Of course, we compare the anatomy all the time, and we compare the embryology, if we can. Interestingly, this fossil with a little circle around it here has a baby, obviously died, and there is the fossil embryo as well, which is wonderful. So we're able to look at what it looked like in development as well as what it looked like in the adult. They are rare, but one does get them. And then all the modern molecular biology of using biochemical markers and doing DNA sequence comparisons, and then complicated bioinformatics, we can get information. For example, I showed you that cladogram. And then lastly, and very critically, we need to look at the art. What is written, what is on caves, on rocks, and in moving to modern times or more recent historical times, we make use of whatever writings we can as well. All of this together gives us a rich pot of information to utilize. And the last thing I wanted to say is it's no good just finding a fossil. First, we have to recognize that I'm not a paleontologist and I would never have known, what that is. But paleontologists do, and they'll say that's a this over this over this, or a broken piece of something. So you very rarely do you get whole fossils like that. But importantly, you need to know what layer they were in. So paleontologists, archaeologists, when they dig, they keep very careful track of what layer they are. And they map their finding to other findings in that area, and also they use chemical analysis to know where you are in the layer. And from there, you can also give a time information. So you get time information and you get space information. And teeth. So teeth of equids are the key thing that enables you to distinguish sometimes, one primitive type from another one, or a donkey from a zebra. And the important thing about equid teeth is they started off looking like that, pretty well like ours, which we bite on. And they develop into these very long structures that grow forever. They have these extended bits of dentine going up, and this becomes the occlusal or the grinding surface. As they moved from being browsers to grazers, the tooth changed. What you can clearly see is what you see in the horse's mouth is nothing as much as what actually is there. You see how big and deep these teeth are. And the deeper and bigger they are, the younger the horse, because they do shorten eventually over time. And if you look at the biting surface, you can see this amazing, it's the perfect grinding surface. And this gets worn down all the time, and a new bit grows up. Okay, so we're starting our 55 million year journey. And the 55 million years ago is the Eocene. Now, the famous paleontologist O.C. March in the 1870s came upon this fossil. And by the way, don't you agree that looks like a fish? But I really can't think it is, but it looks like one there. but this is a fossil of a small browser living in a more forested type of domain. It's about the size of a dog. It has padded feet, like a dog. Legs are flexible and rotatable. It has low crown teeth, like us. And a small brain. We know that from the tiny little brain case. So I read somewhere, and they were stupid. Well, we can't say that, can we? But interestingly, on the end of each pad, instead of a little nail, is what they've called a hooflet. So tiny little nails that have begun to extend just a little bit like a hoof. And at the time, this was very, very exciting because they had been finding other horse fossils, but there was like a blank. And don't forget, it was the period when Darwin had come up with his theory of evolution by natural selection, and people were thinking very strongly that this is a nice. They'd found fossils of these various horse types, and said, well, this is a nice linear progression, and it answers the criticism that creationists give of that there are gaps in the evolutionary process. But actually. And in fact, Haeckel at the time, Haeckel was a German scientist, and he was mad keen about Darwin's theory. And he created this lovely tree of life in 1879. Interestingly, at the time, of course, everyone thought that humans were at the top of the tree. There are the equids coming off there. And everything else is lesser branch, and we are the top of evolution. We know that not to be true. Okay, so this is the timeline. I have the timeline at the top for you so you know where we are. We're starting 55 million years ago in the Eocene. And what we're going to be seeing is that over that 55 million years, the Equus or the equids diversified, spread. This represents how many of them there were at different times. And only here, in the most recent few thousand years, do you get Equus, the horse, and the donkey, and the zebra. So I'm going to take you through a few of these key steps, because from that, we will uncover the story of what our Hipparion is doing in Africa, whether he stayed there. Right, so in the Eocene, Asia and Europe were not connected. They were floating around. North and South America were separate, and Africa was an island. And Eohippus arose in the North American continent. As I said, it was doggish, and there's short legs, and it browsed on fruit and soft leaves, so it didn't have to grind. Here you can see this reconstruction by Dr. Ron Blakey. You can see the whole of Asia separate. In fact, India is separate still. What will become the southern European continent is there. There's Italy, will become Italy. This is northern Europe, and so on. Africa completely an island. And Eohippus then began, and there have been many ice ages and glaciations, and when there's a glaciation, this area, which we now know as the Bering Straits, when the Earth ices up, then all the water goes into the ice, and therefore the sea level drops. So it's not that the Bering Straits were iced up, it was that the ice was being trapped in the Arctic. The sea level drops, exposing land that wouldn't have been exposed before. And at various times, back and forth, there have been ice ages where these connections have been there and then have gone. And Eohippus, also called Hyracotherium, expanded into Asia. And eventually, here a bit of, I don't know, his tooth are here. You can see he used his teeth to browse, little bunodont teeth, little short, blunt teeth. And in the Oligocene, they continue to live in the Oligocene. In fact, Eohippus lived for 20 million years. But what you can see in the late Oligocene, or in the middle Oligocene, Asia is now pushed towards Europe. They're pushing, the tectonic plates are pushing them together. And this made Asia and Europe join. And this resulted in Eohippus now moving into Europe as well. So if you look for fossils of Eohippus, you'll find them in Europe, Asia, and in North America. You don't find them here, and you don't find them here. Why? Because Africa is still an island. They couldn't get into Africa. Okay, now there's a climate change, another change in climate. The Earth's tilt changes slightly. You get slightly warmer in some areas, colder in some areas. And Eohippus promptly dies off everywhere. The last little one there, I've left him there, he will die soon. But it gives rise to Mesohippus, a slightly larger version had evolved. Meohippus and then Myohippus. This is also occurring in the Oligocene. So we're around about 30 million years ago. Slightly larger, size of a collie dog, with 3 toes, one in the middle and 2 on the side. Africa's still an island. Now, I think I'll come back to this slide. I put this slide just to show that as the equids started to evolve and get bigger, and the climate warmed, there were now more grasses, and they had to graze. And when you're grazing, then you're going to be taking sand in. So the teeth need to have grown tougher, stronger, replaceable. And you start to get this typical pattern of, you see, our premolars are little shaft teeth, and our molars are big grinding teeth. if you're going to be mainly being grinding, then you need all your molars, these are the molars here, to be grinding. And so gradually got more and more grinding molars. There's this gap, as we know, and then we have the canines and the incisor teeth in front. And the key thing to distinguish between zebras and donkeys is this tiny little kink in the teeth there. Now you will see in some, it's sharp. It's called the ectoflexid. So you can imagine spending your life identifying fossils by a little kink in the tooth. Many theories are based on exactly that. Okay, so now Myohippus goes on and becomes Merychippus, slightly bigger, really beginning to look like a donkey now, quite primitive looking. And a land bridge forms. So the tectonic plates are now pushing Africa up, and you get a land bridge forming with Arabia here. Notice that the bridge is at the bottom of the Red Sea, not up here at the delta. Here you can see a diagram of it. There's the join is about to happen there. And Hipparion appears in about the middle of the Miocene. Now, so Hipparion was in North Africa. Again, a climate change came to, well, the rescue, and that join occurred, and Hipparion migrates into Asia in huge numbers across and then eventually all the way to Cape Town. So we have Hipparion all over. Now, did Hipparion give rise to modern equids? Well, firstly, they gave rise to Dinohippus, and then they died off. So this is all a story of evolving and then dying. So what do we know? We know that actually this Hipparion didn't evolve further in Africa. They died off. They left their footprints and nothing else. But importantly, Dinohippus was left. In fact, it was an area in the Pliocene of really mass extinction of many, many species. And extinctions come about slowly, over millions of years. Climate changes, vegetation changes. Some animals compete with others. They outcompete their niche. They get more food and so on. So it's not a sudden thing. So that's the answer to our Hipparion story. But let's move on now. And we write down in the Pleistocene. And Dinohippus gives rise to the first real equus, called Equus simplicidans, very, very horse, donkey, zebra-like. Interestingly, you'd be interested to know that Dinohippus also gave rise to this other quite short-limbed horse over a land bridge that had formed between North and South America. But the really interesting thing about this is that it lived to modern times. Literally, the early explorers of about 10,000 years ago that were circulating around the tip record in the documents that they saw lights of people dwelling down here, but also hunting, and there were fossils right down there, and that they really only died out in the last 10,000 years. Now, so what we've seen is a change in size, a change in shape of the head, and going from 3 toes to 1 and a side toe, eventually to a single toe. Now we have equids. And we don't have a single line like that. We have a line that is branching all over the show, better shown back at this picture. So if we want to trace Equus backwards, there's Dinohippus. You can see Hipparion was on a different branch. That whole lot of those died off. Axia, Hypohippus, Anthitherium, this was a very prevalent one, and so on. And so you can imagine the wonderful time paleontologists have had for the last 100 years, finding fossils of each of these and not knowing where they fit in the picture, and most often just having a tooth to go by. So you can imagine it gave rise to lots of personality arguments and egos. if you're an archaeologist, an anthropologist, if you find something, the first of something, you have made it. Okay, now we're at 4 million years ago. So we're into modern times, and this is what the Earth looked like. I've changed maps because now the Earth has stopped floating its continents around a little bit, so I'm keeping to a more accurate map. And I'm going to start off by telling you the zebra's journey. About 2 million years ago, Simplicidens migrated across the Bering Straits. Here he is arriving on the Asia side of the Bering Straits into Asia about 2 million years ago. And in Asia, probably diversified, possibly forming stripes, we don't know. We know from fossils, but we can't tell. Eventually we'll know from coloration genes once we've done that. But obviously, as they evolve and as they get selected for, because they have an advantage somehow, it gets captured in the DNA and it gets passed on to the offspring. And they migrated all the way, and this is over millions of years, or 500,000 years, through the Asian steppes, through the Middle East, crossing into Africa and into the savanna lands of Africa. They were able to penetrate deserts, ice area. Here they are, this beautiful picture at the Mkhadi in Botswana, where zebras still follow ancestral paths of migration, annual migration. And they arrived in Africa, and as we well know, they distributed themselves in different areas. They persisted in Asia for about 1 million years, but then they died out, leaving the zebras only in Africa. So if you see pictures of zebras in Roman artwork or in Syrian, it is because these zebras have been captured and taken to those areas of the world. They're not indigenously there. And the zebras, I think this is a bit of that cladogram I showed you earlier, showing how they're diversified. But this beautiful picture really, just to remind you, the Cape, let's start with the plain zebra is the most common one. There's two types, one with brown stripes and one without brown stripes. Should I turn the lights off for a sec? Okay. Gravies, of course, have got more stripes, and they've got a white tummy, but more stripes per area. And the Cape Mountain zebra really looks very like a plain zebra, but it's also got a white tummy. And down here, we have the Cape Mountain zebra. There are two localities, really, down here in the Cape, and a slightly different version up here in Namibia. Sorry?
Isn't there a tonsils as well?
Yes.
There are about 6.
There are.
Plain zebra. Excuse me? There are about 6 different subspecies of plain zebra, and Hartman's is one of them.
Yeah. You're right. There are a whole lot of subspecies and different colorations in different areas. Correct. Of course, what I didn't mention was until recently we had the quagga. And the quagga, of course, recently died off as well. This is a lovely piece of art of a man in Palestine, in Odessa, found in 2006 when they were uncovering, when they're building to put a parking lot, and they came upon this. And it's a piece of artwork from about 5,000–6,000 AD, clearly Roman. And I'm just using it to demonstrate, well, though he looks quite docile and is being led, in fact, zebras have never allowed themselves to be domesticated. And that poses a very interesting question, which we're not dealing with in this lecture series, of what is it that allows a species to be domesticated and not other. There's many biological reasons, but there's also, in a way, psychological reasons as well. One of the things that really puts humans off trying to domesticate the zebra is that it bites. And apparently what it does is it bites and it holds on and doesn't let go, and that's rather problematic. even till recently, you will see pictures in South Africa of people have managed to domesticate. Well, they haven't really domesticated. They've tamed them a bit. And I'll tell you what domestication is different from taming. So now we're going to the journey of the asses, and we go back to the same ancestor, Simplicidans, that gave rise to the zebra. And he migrated into Asia, giving rise to a whole lot of different ass species. And the asses you will see have longer ears and completely different morphology. These are Indian asses. This is an onager. Typically, you can see the stripe down the back. And often, most commonly, the belly is white. In Africa, there were 3 subspecies. These are 2 different Somalian wild asses. Somalia is there, and you can see their different colors. But the key thing about the Somalian one is it's got stripes on its legs, and it's got a white belly. But this is a very dark one. I think you said this one's in Israel at the moment?
That one's in Israel.
Okay. And then we have the Nubian wild ass, slightly physically very similar, but no stripes on its leg, and it's got this little one stripe coming down from its neck here. And a third ass, the Atlas wild ass, is now extinct. Sorry, let me just go back. There might be a missing slide, but never mind. Okay, now asses were domesticated by the Egyptians and Nubians and perhaps Persians. So if we do genetics of modern day donkeys, we can see genetically, and there are some Nubian asses in the wild, and there's some Somalian asses in the wild. And we can compare ass and donkey DNA. And you can see that there are some that would have been domesticated from the Nubian, and that would have been the Egyptians and the Nubians, who really extended all the way down here. But there is this interesting fragment from Iran showing a piece of pottery where this is clearly a domesticated donkey. It's got a bit of clothing or something on it. And so they claim it was domesticated there, 4,700, a little bit older. These are definitely about 5,000 years ago. And this just clearly shows the sites of domestication. There is the one, there is the other, and the Atlas wild ass, which was domesticated in North Africa and was used in the Roman games. And this picture is showing it is Atlas wild ass. It's got a line down there, and it's also got stripes. So that they speculate that it's a mixture between the Nubian and the Somalian. But of course, you should be asking me, well, what's a tiger doing in Africa? There are no tigers in Africa. But in fact, the Romans brought the tigers from Asia in their games, in the amphitheaters in Italy itself and in North Africa. And so much so that they actually probably contributed greatly to the extinction of the Atlas wild ass, though there was a drying period as well. Now, why domesticate? Why would humans have taken a look at this and said, no, there are asses wandering around, but why should we domesticate them? Why should we control them? Well, the answer is quite easy. If you have your food nearby, you don't have to go and hunt it, it's easier. They found, due to their temperament, to their physical structure, they were highly adaptable to the environment. They were able to go for long periods without water. They were unfussy about food. They seemed ideal as partners to humans, and they seemed compliant in being that partner. This little quote from Upper Egypt in about the 23rd century BC. Inscriptions of the trader Harkuf, Inscriptions on his tomb tell us what he brought back from the land of Yam in Nubia, very romantic, on his donkeys. Incense, ebony, heknu oil, which was the critical oil for embalming, grains, panther skins, and ivory. There must have been leopards, I think, and ivory. So what the donkeys enabled early cultures to do was to spread their civilization much wider and strengthen the economies and development. The Egyptians, of course, were much revered their donkeys, and you'll see them in many, many, many representations in tombs. This particular one of Kumhotep the second, donkey carrying 2 children, carrying goods. Here, I don't know if you can see it well, here they're threshing sorghum probably, loading it onto the back of the donkey, chasing the donkey along, and here the donkey is also being used for threshing. This comes from Dynasty 5 in the Old Kingdom, from the Memphite region. They were able to traverse long distances. This is also a representation of perhaps, this is the donkey being eaten by a crocodile along the way. And in Abydos, in Egypt, there are burial sites where kings and queens have had donkeys buried with them. One way of looking at it is because they greatly revered them, but the other way of looking at it is, well, I read that they needed transport in their afterlife, and so they made sure that they had lots of donkeys to do that. And this particular one is the tomb of Mernith in Abydos, and it comes from about 3100 BC. You can clearly see it's a donkey from its jaw, from its skull, from the chunkiness of its skeleton. And eventually the donkeys were replaced by the camel, which was brought in by Cambyses of Persia in about 525 BC. Remember, Cambyses penetrated the whole right up to Constantinople and down into Egypt. But donkeys are still used today, taking people across the desert, the sands. Many, many cultures and tribes in Africa continue to use donkeys for all sorts of goods carrying. It's amazing the amount that a donkey can carry. Look at this, it's got 3 people on, oh no, the man standing, and lots of goods. Very strong, very patient. And widespread in Africa, doing agricultural work, transport, and many other things. And now we come to the horse's journey. And here I'm going to bring in humans a little bit more, because the horse's journey and the human journey have had a long time together. And though we won't deal with it today, I'm sure there are horse people in this audience that will tell you of the very, very special relationship between horses and humans. And where did that come from? We unfortunately can't touch it, but I'll tell you the time periods at least. We go back to our Equus simplicidans, migrated now into Asia at the time of the last glaciation. You can see this is a representation showing the Arctic glaciated almost right down here into Italy, part of India actually. And they were able to cross the Bering Straits. And no, they didn't walk through the ice. Remember, the ice wasn't there in the Bering Straits. It was up in the Arctic. But they did cross steppes. This is steppe land in Asia. They did cross many mountain ranges. They did penetrate into various parts of the world, Europe, Africa. This gives you a sense of what these primitive horses would have looked like. These are modern horses that are said to be the most primitive. Yes? Okay. Sorry, you okay? Przalski has got a very big, chunky head. lives up in northern Mongolia in the Russian steppes. Przalski was nearly extinct but was rescued at the last minute, and there's a massive rehoming and rebreeding program going on with Przalskis. The tarpan is extinct. They were hunted out. The environment, the humans hunted them out, and the terrain and the forest lands that they dwelt in shrunk. But the conic is a modern-day version, and there is a project to try and reintroduce the tarpan. Partly from a Polish horse that looks quite similar, and from these horses, these are Sarayas, which are found in Portugal and in Spain. And there's a breeding program to try and recreate the tarpan. Now, I need to explain. This now becomes quite complicated. So, at the last age, 10,000 years ago, there were really 6 different horse types. They were all horses, but I want to draw your attention to these here. These that hugged the North African coast and into Asia Minor, they were called Equus pompelli, and they were quite large, medium size. These that came into Iberia, to Spain, were tarpan-like. And then we had Przalski type up here, and we have out in this area here, it's not really represented, a smaller type. I'll show you some pictures of them. So this is 10,000 years ago at the last ice age. This one is the same picture, but a bit more complicated. Now, why I'm showing you this is and this is where the literature becomes very hard to work through. Because there were horses, certainly, if I look at this map, it would suggest that they had a lot of fossil finds. But in fact, there's only one fossil find in Tunisia. So I'm not sure that it justifies this full red region here. And it's likely that the horses that were here died out. And there were only horses in Europe and Asia. So they didn't penetrate the heartland of Africa. But what was going on in Africa? What was going on in Africa was humans were evolving. And while they were evolving, they would have had contact with hipparions, and we've seen from the footprints originally, they would have had contact with zebras and asses, and they would have been hunting them. As the human and hominids evolved, they would have had contact and hunted, and there's lots of evidence of that. But in about 80,000 years ago, they entered, let me show you this picture first. The hunter-gatherers lived in small groups, and at the last glacial maximum, they retreated into because when there's a glaciation, the continents dry out. And so humans moved to where the big rivers were, for example, the Nile, into this region here. And from there, this is from a paper just a month ago. It's an update because they're always updating, because they're always finding fossils. But it would appear that there were at least 2 migrations. We know that Neanderthals would have migrated into Europe and Asia, and Denisovans much earlier. But humans, true humans, it seems that there were 2 sets of migrations. One there, when this part was, they were able to get through there, and then about 80,000 years ago, going through the bottom of the Red Sea here. And then distributing them all over the world, all the way down into Australia. But critically, they would have come upon horses. Sorry. And there would have been horses of many, many different types in Eurasia. Big ones, small ones, more primitive looking, slightly more advanced. So much so that, as we well know, they were painted in many cave paintings right across Europe and in Asia. These beautiful paintings are from Lascaux, about 30,000 years ago. But what they did was they promptly killed them off, all of them, just about. So there's lots of evidence to show that humans chased large herds of horses over cliffs, and around millions of bones at the end there. And here's a device, a sort of boomerang device for killing. And early humans, nearly hunted horses to extinction. And in fact, the truth is they believe that it was domestication that saved horses from going to extinction. And domestication began in the river valley civilizations. This one is in Egypt. We have Egypt. We have the Yellow River in China. And we, of course, have Mesopotamia with the Tigris and the Euphrates River, where human civilizations really came together. They started to make little towns, little villages, and they began to gather and get more organized. And the more organized they got, the more they realized they needed more help. And the more help they could get, clearly they saw that horses could clearly are powerful, much more powerful than donkeys, much more powerful. I haven't mentioned other species, and made a good decision to try and domesticate them. Now, humans had pretty good practice in domestication. In fact, they'd been domesticating for maybe 8,000 years. But what is domestication? It is when humans take control of another species and control its breeding. Then they are domesticated. Eventually, some domesticated animals cannot breed without human help at all. So that is what domestication is, different to just taming. Taming is just stopping them being wild, but it's not controlling them. And the domesticated species, in a way, must be willing to breed in man's company. Some people say there must be mutual benefit. I do wonder about that. So they started dogs about 12,000 years ago, cattle 7,000 years ago, and draft animals, including the horse, about 4,000 years ago. Cat's very recent. And I'm going to go quick here, but basically, to look for evidence of domestication, you need to look both at for evidence on the actual animal, if you can find it. So, for example, if a donkey was being ridden, you might find that the spine is altered in a particular way, or the jaw is altered. So you look for changes. I take dogs as an example. Why are there so many different dogs? Because if humans hadn't come along, we'd still just have the wolf, because they are naturally adapted to the environment. But in fact, we've bred and bred and bred and bred, and we get this diversity. So the more diversity you get, the more support that is for domestication. And then you look for other evidence that relate, where they're buried, lifestyle patterns of the human cultures with them. So it's a very complex subject. And changes in morphology. And I just want to get to, there's clear evidence that they were domesticated in regions of Eurasia, the Eurasian steppes, bow-tie settlements in Kazakhstan, and in Ukraine, in southwest Russia, and in west Kazakhstan. People argue about where the first one was. Pretty well, they were all happening around about 3,500 years ago. And they spread rapidly. And again, the question is, did the knowledge spread, or did the domesticated animals spread? And researchers in that field can able to distinguish between those two things and other mixtures of them. They began to be put to work for transportation, agriculture, and very much warfare. And the last talk that we'll give on Wednesday is how much they played a role in warfare and how they changed civilizations. The question of whether they were ridden first or were pulled by chariots is another question. Here are some lovely pictures from Egypt, 18th dynasty, showing that they were ridden. Clearly no stirrups at this stage, but there's a lot of research around riding first or chariots first. And it depends on the size of the horse and which part of the world. So they were domesticated, no doubt, in many regions. And remember, there were all these different types of horses everywhere. So that's going to tell us that we're going to get lots and lots of domesticated species. So they were variable before we domesticated them. And these are just the dynasties of Egypt. And I just want to point out in this period here, these intermediate periods in Egypt are periods of unrest. Governance is falling apart, the kings are losing power, civil society is not in control. And as with any such situation, outsiders, foreigners, can come in and take control. And that is what happened with Egypt. Groups of Middle Easterns called the Hyksos, coming probably from Canaan, Israel area, possibly a little bit up here in Syria, migrated, infiltrated, slowly percolated in. There was no big fight, no big war. In fact, they first came in for trade and barter. But they brought with them the horse into Africa, the domesticated horse into Africa. So they credited with bringing the first horses to Africa. They set up their capital at Avaris, and they brought the horse, they brought the chariot, and they brought the composite bow, a bow that you can pull and shoot further. What evidence do we have? We have there's lots of evidence, but for example, that was their capital. You can see it was in the Delta. Here is a burial of the horse of the 18th dynasty in the Ramesside period. This is a wonderful story of the first mention of a chariot by a gentleman Ahmose on the walls of another Ahmose who was a soldier from El Kab, a town in Egypt. And it was he was an official in a district, and here you can see this beautiful hieroglyph of the chariot. It was the first mention of the chariot in writing, and he wrote it he followed on foot as his king rode the chariot into war. And then lastly, to finish tonight, we'll briefly mention the fortress of Buin. Buin was unfortunately lies beneath Lake Nasser in Egypt and in northern Sudan. It was built in the Middle Kingdom about 2000 approximately BC, and there's Lake Nasser there now. And it was one of a series of trading posts and strategic strongholds erected by kings in the 12th dynasty. And exploration led by Walter Emery before the flood. So remember, when they were making the dam after the Second World War, there was this call that they're going to flood this vast area of Egypt. And many, many archaeologists, anthropologists went in to try and get out, and Egyptians, and they dug out as much as they could. And this was one of them. Here you see he found a mirror in that fort. And in exploring the fort, they came upon a horse buried deep in the walls of the fort. And let's just read that. It seems that during the first sacking of the fortress in 1675 BC, that a horse perhaps had stalled between two bastions of the main fortress, was killed and fell to the ground, where its body lay on a brick pavement. It was then immediately covered with rubble, and later remains of the horse were sealed into this deposit by the brickwork. Very fortuitously, it was built in by the brickwork on top of it. And so it was there ready to be exposed many, many, many years later. And here it actually is lying in the wall. This is a bit of the fort of what it looked like before it was flooded. And there can be no dispute about its date. Now, the first fact established was that it did represent a horse and not an ass and a zebra. And there they used the teeth story to do that. The horse, because the horse was not indigenous to ancient Egypt, where the ass was common, both as a wild and domestic animal, it is likely that gravy zebra was also available. So the question is, was it a zebra or an ass? But no, it was a horse, based on the tooth. The early explorers were not, that has been done by later investigations of this fossil, of this body, which, by the way, has traveled to many places around the world and keeps getting lost in museums, and people fight about it. I don't know where it is right now. Do you know? We don't know. In Khartoum now. Okay. Juliet Cluttenbrock and Peter Rawling have written a 100-page article on it. It's wonderful. And the last thing, evidence that was domesticated was and bitted, because when the bit goes into the mouth, it can wear the teeth. And they claim that some of those first premolars were worn, and therefore it was bitted. But you can imagine the whole argument rests on a tooth again. So what we'll do tomorrow is we'll talk about the Hyksos and how they were defeated, and then how the horses spread. Now we're going to move more into Africa with just horses. And we're going to look at rock art, we're going to look at skeletal material, and of course we're going to look at the living specimens at the moment. And so I thank you for your attention. And I'm happy to take questions, and Erica will answer them all. Yes, ma'am.
Can I ask what happened about America?
Oh, good question. I didn't go. I'll touch on it tomorrow. But what happened was, can I save it for tomorrow? Yeah. So in fact, they were bare. They had no horses till recently. Yeah, we sent horses from Africa.
Can you just go back to your
Sure.
almost beginning?
Yes.
With those 8 points, you know, with the fossils, the bio.
Yes. Sure. There's can we? Where is my? Can we go back? I just want.
And then in between, what are the horses of the Camargue? What kind of horses are they?
Of the Camargue.
Yeah.
Erica will answer that question.
I'll try to, because we haven't
Stand up.
think so much of European horses.
Yeah.
But I would say
They've been there forever.
they have been there forever, but as far as I know, they're not originally wild.
I think the question is, and I'll find out for you, and I'll give you an answer tomorrow. But I think I was just reading last night that they might be closely associated with the Sorayas, but they are in Portugal, are they not?
No.
Oh, in France, on the border. So you. I will look up my sources and try and give you some answer tomorrow. So that slide, they want to go back right to the beginning. Okay, let's get 8 points. Keep going. There. One up. That one. Oh. Okay, you want to ask your question? Oh, you wanted them? Oh, sure. I'm sure there's many other things here as well. This is just touching on the different things that I have made use of. The research that has been done, and I do want to say that all these beautiful images that you see, a large percentage of them have been done by Erica. She's been hiving into museums and libraries and the internet, and so she's done a lot of the research over many, many years. So I'm persuading her to speak. Can I take any other questions? Anything you'd like us to look up and tell you tomorrow? Okay, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Have a good evening. Good timing.